Well, good morning, everyone. Before I pray over the message, I know the last time I spoke, I had talked about how I was getting bullied to tell one of my jokes, and that people were actually like pushing on the stall door. I couldn't get out until I told a joke, and I thought that was really kind of crazy. And that happened again, so I'm not going to tell a joke, but I'm going to tell a funny, true story. And I don't know if you guys have heard about all of these food processing plants around our country that have been either they're burning down or there was one actually, a plane actually crashed into it. And some people are wondering if it's kind of a conspiracy that's going on. But there was one story that caught my eye, and it was about a shoe factory. Okay, and it was a very large shoe factory that had a very severe fire. And the story said that there were 10,000 souls lost and that a disgruntled heel started the fire. So we need to pray for those people who lost their jobs at that shoe factory. All right. All right. Let's pray. All right, Father, I want to thank you for a spectacular, um, beautiful May morning. Boy, just could not ask for a better day. And I just want to lift this message up to you. I pray that your Holy Spirit would fill every single centimeter of this building. I pray that the words spoken are your unfiltered scriptures, Lord, truth. And I just pray that I would be invisible, Lord, that you would speak through me. And I just ask that you would just pierce our hearts with what your scriptures has to say. I lay it before you in your Son's name, Jesus. Amen. All right, well, we are in Proverbs, and I love the Old Testament. There are so many rich stories that I feel I can learn from. When I read the Old Testament, I feel like I'm talking to my grandfather. My grandfather lived right next to me when I was growing up. And as I've gotten older, I feel just so blessed to have someone so wise to grow up with. And that's how I feel about the Old Testament. It's like talking to my grandfather, listening to what real people had to deal with 2,000 years ago. We're the same people, just time and technology is the only difference. And in Proverbs, I have to, when you talk about Proverbs, you have to talk about King Solomon, of course, right? And my favorite author of all time is Mark Twain. I love Mark Twain. I love his stories. I love his little quips and common sense little statements. He has this biting, dry humor that I just can't get enough of. I just love it. And when I think of Proverbs and King Solomon, I feel like he is the Mark Twain of the Bible. There are things in Proverbs that you read and you reread it again and you get something different from it every single time. And in Proverbs 8, this is probably my favorite chapter in Proverbs, and it's Lady Wisdom. And I remember talking about this passage in a men's group several years ago. And their question, the very first question is, well, why is it Lady Wisdom? Why isn't it, something else? And I remembered that question and I thought, I'm going to research that. And the reality is the Bible doesn't really say why it's called Lady Wisdom. The only thing that we know is in the Hebrew language, wisdom is a feminine noun. That's all we know. And so you're looking at a time when this was written, this was a very male-dominated culture. And so for it to be called Lady Wisdom is very unique. There are things in here that we can glean from in our postmodern, high-tech world that back then they couldn't even imagine would even be a reality. So let's start in verse 1 and Proverbs chapter 8. We're going to be reading through 1 through 14. Do you hear Lady Wisdom calling? Can you hear Madam Insight raising her voice? She's taken her stand at First and Main, at the busiest intersection. Right in the city square where the traffic is thickest, she shouts, You, I am talking to all of you, everyone out here on the streets. Listen, you idiots, learn good sense. You blockheads, shape up. Don't miss a word of this. I'm telling you how to live well. I'm telling you how to live at your best. My mouth chews and savors and relishes truth. Now that I want you to remember. I can't stand the taste of evil. You only hear true and right words from my mouth. Not one syllable will be twisted or skewed. You'll recognize this as true. You, with open minds, truth, ready minds, will see it all at once. Prefer my life disciplines over chasing after money and God knowledge over a lucrative career. Now, I'm going to stop there for a second. When we talk about King Solomon, he is a very interesting character. Of course, he is the son of King David. But early in his career as a king, God basically asked him and said, okay, King Solomon, I'm going to give you whatever you ask for. And I know a lot of times we have this thinking like, well, man, if someone were to give me a wish, what would I wish for? And of course, a lot of people would be like, well, I would ask for 1,000,000 more wishes, right? And it doesn't work that way, of course. And so when King Solomon is pondering this question from God, his answer was pretty amazing. I ask for wisdom. And because King Solomon stated wisdom, God is like, you have chosen well. I'm going to give you all the other things that you would want. As his life progressed, as his tenure as king moved into other areas of his life, he became a person that many people from all over came to visit. His wisdom was amazing. He built the temple. His wealth and excesses were unmatched by anybody. This is a man who had the focus in the correct place early on as king. God was very pleased with his choice. And because he chose wisdom, he was able to utilize and be a wise steward of what God had given him. He was highly exalted. People wanted to do business with him. He was someone that if you were connected with him, you had made it, and there was no getting around it. God's blessing and favor was probably, I don't know if there really is going to be a person that was as blessed with wisdom and riches than King Solomon. It was really a life of just unimaginable success. His focus was on wisdom and the truth that God had given him. However, we know that things don't turn out later in his years as well as it did in the beginning, unfortunately. Now, in normal fashion, I want to share a story with you, and it ties directly into what real wisdom is. About 10, 12 years ago, it was right before the housing bubble of 2007, 2008. I was employed at a company that was doing very well. We were a small division of this company that had grown very successful. And it got to the point where this division was actually holding up the rest of the company. The plant manager, who had been there for several years, had left, and they had taken a vice president from the corporate office and moved him into that position temporarily. And I was a little skeptical. I didn't know, because the plant manager we had had before was really smart, but just was not a people person at all. And this VP that came in, we hit it off immediately. This guy had taken a very, the morale at this plant was very low because of the prior management. And this guy came in, and his priority was the people. It was a union shop, and you know, we dealt with a lot of pretty rough guys. A lot of people were off work release, and it was a rough and tumble place. And this guy came in, and he made it all about the employees, and he made that the case. He would walk around in his, high-end suit around the floor, asking guys, patting them on the back, even the people working in the office. He'd stock the conference room with free beverages, and it was just wonderful. And the ideas that this guy had, he valued the people who worked there. And I had only been there about 6 or 7 years at that time, and it was the first time I actually had ever received a bonus. Like, I just couldn't believe it. I was just floored. And he had said how much he had appreciated my efforts. Well, as we all know, as 2007 and 8 started to progress, the housing bubble started to unfold on the economy. And a roaring factory where we were running shifts 24 hours a day, within a month, it just dried up like that. And those of you who work in corporate settings know that your job depends on two things. It's 50% performance, and it's 50% where you fit in the political structure of that company. And whoever happens to be the leader of that company, well, they may value performance, or they may value the political end. And this VP that came in, well, they made things very hard for him. He had been there about 2 years, and everyone loved him, but the pressure that they put on him was so much that one day he just left, and I never saw him again. He was so hurt by what had happened, the pressure and the anxiety that they had pressed on him. He couldn't take it anymore, and I never saw the guy again. I've never been in a situation like that before, and I had learned so much from him. The wisdom, the head knowledge, the street smarts that this guy had, I would have followed this guy off of a cliff. I really would have. I just loved this guy, and even to this day, I think about him. Well, there were upper management that were shuffling things around, and we had this real young guy running the company who had been very highly educated, and he was making moves that for the people working, the working class, the simple people like me, were not appreciating. And I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to tell you how this ends, but it fits right into what we're talking about today. All right, I want to continue in Proverbs. So we're on verse 11. For wisdom is better than all the trappings of wealth. Nothing you could wish for holds a candle to her. I am Lady Wisdom. I live next to sanity, knowledge, and discretion live just down the street. The fear of God means hating evil, whose ways I hate with a passion, pride and arrogance and crooked talk. Good counsel and common sense are my characteristics. I am both insight and the virtue to live it out. Now, I want to go back to the earlier part of this because there's one verse that sticks out, and you're going to see a theme in this passage. There's two things that have to connect in order for wisdom and knowledge to work, okay? So it says right in here, she's taken her stand at First and Main and the busiest of intersections, right in the city square where the traffic is thickest. She shouts, "You, I'm talking to all of you, everyone out here on the streets. Listen, you idiots, learn good sense, you blockheads, shape up. Don't miss a word of this. I'm telling you how to live well. I'm telling you how to live your best." This is where it is. My mouth chews and savors and relishes truth. I can't stand the taste of evil. We live in a time right now where truth matters. And the last time I had given a message, I was talking to you about how we are at a state of war. Our country right now is in a proxy war against Russia. And both sides, we live in a very divided world. And both agree that the first casualty of war is truth. People are starving for truth. Truth matters. What we are seeing today unfold in our church, the Big C church, the postmodern church, is a questioning of that truth. There are terms that are coming out of deconstructing my beliefs. There's this replacement theology. We're at a place in our country right now where one of the greatest documents ever written by mankind, the United States Constitution, is being questioned. The Bible, by many people who call themselves believers, will say, well, I don't know if the Bible really is relevant to today. These are things that are attacking not only our country, but spiritually, the family, the greatest global community the world's ever known, which is the church. This is where knowledge and wisdom come together. There is a new religion that is coming to our paths, and that is the whole idea of knowledge and education. That is now being valued more than the truths of God. Now, I want to ask you a question. Do you remember what the first sin was? It was eating from the tree of what? Knowledge of good and evil. And the promise that Satan had given both Adam and Eve was what? If you eat of this tree, you will be just like a god. We live in a time now where knowledge is the new religion. It's not biblical truth. It's not accountability. And what happens is when knowledge is not connected to God's truth, well, it winds up becoming something that can blind you to a point where you don't even know where you stand on anything. I'm not against education, okay? Please don't get me wrong. My father was a math teacher, a school principal for almost 40 years. He had a master's degree. My mom was a registered nurse. My brother had a master's degree. I have a college degree. And there is a lot to be gleaned from knowledge. There's even a lot to be gleaned from worldly knowledge. You can get great riches. You can be healthy. You can connect with people. You can live a very good life. But as believers, we know that these are temporary. These are things that can get in the way of what God has for us. If knowledge is not connected with the truth of God, well, the scripture says it's nothing more than filthy rags. It has to be connected to the unfiltered truth of God. If it isn't, it's practically worthless. Now, we were talking about King Solomon. Because of his lavish lifestyle, because of the excesses that he was able to gain, the knowledge that he had acquired over that time, it ultimately became his downfall. Because so many people wanted to know what King Solomon knew, the connections, the business dealings. He had created alliances with all sorts of other kingdoms and countries. And during that time, when you did that, you also acquired people. And in his case, it was wives and concubines, okay? And I know that's not something that in our time today that we can really relate to, but that's how business was done back then. Unfortunately, many of these countries and kingdoms that he did business with, well, they served foreign gods. And he had so many wives, hundreds of them. Let's just say that Hugh Hefner and the Mormons had nothing on this guy. He had a lot of wives. Some estimate 700, which also added to the problems, because they influenced him to sacrifice gods to their gods, not the one true God. And you can just imagine, when you have people like that in your influence, they're going to influence you as well. He started making very poor decisions. The excesses that he became used to started to drain some of the treasury. The kingdom that he started out with was not the one that he ended with, unfortunately. What he wound up doing was what's called changing price tags. The price tags that he put on the things that should have been valuable, well, he cheapened them. And the things that actually were very worthless, he put a high price tag on. He flip-flopped the foundation of his life. The very foundation that God allowed him to see success, well, he replaced that with something else. Now I'm going to go back and I want to talk about how that story ends with where I worked. So we wound up being visited by one of the big corporate officers. This company I worked for was part of a conglomerate. They had owned companies all over the world. And I can remember this guy pulling up to where I worked, had a $100,000 Audi, catered lunch. All of us are looking around saying, well, we know something's up. There's just no getting around it. And so we sat down for a lunch, and we found out that this brand new president that was young and highly educated and was supposed to have all the answers, in a bid to increase the profits of the company, he decided to do something very unethical. Now, the companies that we produce parts for, you would recognize them immediately, and I'm not going to say who they are, but they are household names. I guarantee you, every one of you has a part that we made in it in one of your appliances or gizmos. It was huge, okay? These are Fortune 500 international companies that we provided parts for. And what this man decided to do was, even though we had contract pricing, which meant that you couldn't increase the price for like 3 or 4 years on these parts, and we made millions of these parts, they decided to just sneakily, just maybe add another penny or half a penny to each part that was sold. And some bean counter in another state figured out something isn't right here. We're getting overbilled, but it's not a lot, but with the amount that we're buying, it's going to add up to serious money. Well, he wound up basically stealing millions of dollars from these companies from overbilling, and one person happened to find it. Well, when the news got out, everyone's like, well, we do business with that company. Maybe they're doing it to us. Well, sure enough, that's exactly what happened. It got into the press, and they basically let this president go. He got a golden parachute, an unbelievable severance, went on to another job where he made even more money, and guess who gets to deal with all the mess of what he had done? It was people like myself, the workers on the floor. We didn't get raises for 5 years. Some people took pay cuts. A man who had all this knowledge, right, but used it for something that was really for evil. They wound up replacing someone who had street smarts, incredible wisdom, how to deal with people, use resources in a better way. They put so much pressure on him that he actually had to leave. Do you see what I'm trying to say, folks? Wisdom and knowledge are not the same. This guy who had been the president, who had built companies out of millions, he was a smart guy. I think he might have even been Ivy League educated. In his mind, he was wise because of the knowledge that he had, but he wasn't. He almost brought the company under. And I'm going to tell you, as the years went on, that company never really recovered. It wound up being sold. It went through multiple presidents, and now it's barely a shadow of what it once was. It talks about, in the scriptures, when evil men rule, the people groan because they don't use godly wisdom. I was listening to a podcast about a week ago, And I had to look this up to see if it was real, okay? I'm not a hunter. I know nothing about hunting. I love the outdoors, but I'm not anything to do with animals or anything like that. But they were talking about how when ranchers have a wolf problem, okay, and they're attacking their livestock, there is a very easy way to kill that wolf. And I thought this has to be something out of a movie, right? I mean, there's just no way this can be real. But it was true. So when you have a wolf problem, you take a knife, okay, a big, like, bladed hunting knife, and you dip it in another animal's blood over and over. You freeze it. Okay, you put one layer, you freeze it. You put another layer, you freeze it. You keep doing this until you get a thick layer of blood on this knife. And of course, you have to make sure it's very sharp before you do this. They take the knife handle and they put it in basically like a bucket of water and they freeze it. Okay, and then you bust it open. So this knife handle is in this block of ice. You put it in the forest, and then you put snow around it. Because the wolf's appetite for blood is so insatiable, of course, the wolf will find it, and he starts to lick it, okay? What happens is as the wolf licks it, you can guess, it slashes its tongue. And it is not able to discern its own blood from the animal blood that was frozen on the blade, okay? What happens is the wolf walks away and bleeds to death. And the rancher will find it dead somewhere on his land or whatever, or if it's with a pack, the pack will just devour the wolf. Folks, when we worship knowledge, okay, above God's truth, that is the knife, okay? That knife is knowledge. It is useful for something. You could use it for a lot of different things. But if it is not connected to the truth of God, well, you're going to wind up licking it, and spiritually, you're going to bleed to death. We live in a time right now, and Rachel and I have talked about this. It is not a mistake that everyone in here is living at the time we are living in right now. I personally believe we are in the last days. I don't have any doubt about it in my mind, okay? I don't know when Jesus is coming. I have no idea. But when I think about what the church is going through right now, our nation, okay, truth is at a premium. It has to be held in the highest regard possible. Because if the Christian terms that we use, okay, grace, mercy, all of those things, they're all wonderful things. But if they're not tied to the truth of God, they just wind up becoming an unhealthy tolerance for inexcusable sin. Does that make sense? It has to be held in the highest regard. Because if it is not connected to the truth, it is nothing more than filthy rags. Each night when I go to bed, I'm constantly praying for godly wisdom. Not just worldly wisdom, godly wisdom, to see things that God only sees. Unfortunately, with King Solomon, he had that godly wisdom. He had the blinders taken off of him, and people admired the man probably unequal to anyone that's ever lived. But because of the people that he hung around with, the wives, the dealings, all of it, the excesses became more important than the godly wisdom that he had been given. He was licking the blade. There's no other way to say it. He was licking the blade. We live in a time where spiritually we have got to be on our A game. Jesus is the only way. There is no other way. And I know that offends people. Well, that's just, I'm sorry, folks, it's just the reality. Scripturally, that is wisdom. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Wisdom equals freedom, but it also means accountability, which is many in the church don't want anymore. And of course, the world's going to be the world, so we know how that's going to end up as well. But we are the salt and light that is supposed to be sharing this message. And if we're not on our A game, folks, well, we're going to be in big trouble. The temperature of the culture that we live in is a direct reflection and result of the condition of the church. We have a little bit to blame for what's going on in our world right now. We really do. Because I don't think the church has been on its A game. And I mean the big C church. I'm not just talking about the river. I'm just saying we have not been on our A game. When I look at the things that are happening, I can't blame the people in this world for acting out the way that they do. We are in a spiritual battle. There are levers being pulled in the spiritual realm that directly impact everything that we are seeing right now. I think of Ephesians 6:12. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. The worldly wisdom will never overtake what God has for his church. One of the most incredible verses that I go to all the time is 1 Corinthians 1:27. And it says, but God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God will use whatever God chooses to use to influence the world. And he chooses to use the church. So as we conclude this, I want to just ask you, are you licking the blade? It's a silly question, but it really isn't. There are things, because of our sinful nature, because of who we are, we're weak people without God. That blade looks so enticing. And it doesn't just have to be the normal things that we always think of, the pleasures of the world. It can be how we think. It can be our attitude, our view of people, our view of God, our view that God has of us. Those are all things that you have to think about before you lick that blade. There's nothing wrong with knowledge. It is a wonderful thing. There are so many things that we have been able to benefit from because of man's knowledge. But when it becomes a substitute for God's truth, well, you're going to bleed to death spiritually if you're not careful. These are things that we can glean from Proverbs. And all I ask is as we continue through our weekend and our week, the people that we have in our sphere of influence, think about that. Please connect the knowledge that you have with the truth of God. Without it, its impact is limited, okay? The knowledge that we have is nothing more than filthy rags until it's connected with the scriptures and the truth of God.